Welcome to Mastering CS Candid Leader Insights, the podcast where we deep dive into the world of customer success with industry leaders. I'm your host, Irina Cismas, and today's guest is Craig Taylor, Head of Customer Success at SimplePoll. Craig, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for the invite, Irina. Much appreciated.
Craig, you started out in learning and development. How do you think that experience has influenced the way you approach CS in general?
I'm so pleased that that's one of the first questions that you've asked, because for some time now I've been selling to people there's a massive overlap between learning development and customer success. And I think the longer I'm in customer success, the bigger I see that overlap being. To answer your question, when I first started working in learning and development many years ago, we were very much seen as order takers. An internal customer would come along and they'd asked for a course to be purchased, or a piece of e-learning to be built, or a video to be produced, or a course to be paid for. And back then, we were very happy just to take that as an order. We would say, yes, no worries, let me make that happen. And we made it happen. What we weren't very good at all those years ago was better understanding what the outcome was that the internal customer was looking for. So we just focused on the input. We never really focused on the output, the goal, what success looked like for that internal customer, what the number was they were looking to impact. Learning and development has got much better at that over the years. And now we always pay a great focus on why. What is the outcome you're looking to achieve? What is the goal you're trying to achieve? So when I moved across into customer success, I found that was really helpful, because although we clearly are interested in producing an input alongside that customer, we're probably more interested in finding out what impact are you trying to have, what goal are you trying to impact, what number are you trying to maintain or change in some way. So that focus on the big picture outcomes from my learning and development background has really influenced my approach with customer success.
If I would summarize what you said, I remain with learning and development is 1.0, and CS was a natural evolution or transformation, and it builds on the learning and development part. But I've run a series of discussions and interviews with dozens of head of CS, but I think you are the first one who had a strong background in learning and development. And it was like, this man actually went through several learning and development roles, and he actually ended up working in CS. And now I have to ask you, what was the moment or the milestone that actually convinced you to make the switch? So what was the trigger?
It was completely accidental. Completely accidental.
I wouldn't have expected that. I would have thought you would say that it came as a natural transition.
No.
So why accidental?
No. Some years ago, I was working in a role that I wasn't particularly happy in. It was a learning and development role. And I contacted a friend of mine who was the CEO of his own startup, quite a small business. And I somewhat jokingly asked him, his name was Ben. I said, Ben, do you have any jobs going? And he messaged me back and said, actually, we possibly do. So after some conversations, I went to work at the startup business that he had at the time as a solutions architect. It was a learning and development role because he had a learning and development online platform. I'd been there several months and we were having a few chats over the while, and the role never quite felt right. What I was doing felt right, but the role itself on paper didn't quite feel like a perfect fit. So back in probably the autumn, the fall of 2015, so 9 years ago now, he said to me, Craig, would you like to head up our customer success function? Would you like to run the customer success team? Mm-hmm. And I'll be really, really honest with you, Irina. I thought it was a job title that he'd made up. I really did. I had never heard at that point of customer success. Now, when you think this was almost 10 years ago, that's not that surprising, because although it existed back then, it wasn't as well known in SaaS businesses as it is in 2024, nearly 2025. Yeah. So I did a little bit of Googling and actually discovered, no, this is a genuine role. This is a genuine thing. And actually, it sounded perfectly like what I was doing day to day anyway. So my job title changed. What I
Okay.
was actually doing day to day, there were hardly any changes whatsoever. So completely true story. I stumbled into the world of customer success. Of my boss at the time, it was not something that I went looking for or had even heard of at that point in time.
I do resonate with you thinking that this role is actually invented. I was there back then. I had the impression that this customer success is actually a buzzword and it's a fancy terminology for support. Of course, I was wrong. But in my defense, I was doing everything that customer success was doing, from onboarding the customer, making sure that it's successful. And the part which I also resonate, you mentioned that why we do what we do. And okay, I don't actively work on the CS, but in marketing, we also have this part where start with the why you do what you do. And this is what actually makes a powerful communication, and it actually helps and it resonates with the user. So again, it's something that I can totally understand the why. And I'm glad that it's also in the CS space. Now, I want to go on the heavy part of things, and I want to discuss about business metrics, because you moved the needle and you impacted the business metrics that are the most important for C-suite, and that is NRR, time to value, NPS. Now I have to ask, how did you manage to do that, and what is your playbook? Because definitely a lot of CS leaders will want to hear, how did you manage to do that?
So there wasn't one playbook that kind of governed, that did all of those things and other things. They would each have their own playbook, their own sequence, their own workflow as such. And sometimes they might have more than one playbook or sequence, depending on the size of that customer, whether they were an enterprise or a small to medium business. So there was no one magic one that did all of those things. They each had their own little secrets to them. In terms of the one thing that knitted them all together, which is that I'm a big believer in being data driven or data informed, perhaps to be more accurate. Every playbook that I set up and run, I will always try my damnedest to make sure that it is using real, tangible data to inform that playbook, rather than just being triggered off something somewhat spuriously. In terms of the NRR that you mentioned and the impact I was able to have there, probably the single biggest factor in that playbook, which wasn't in play before I started in that business at the time, was to fully understand the why of the customer. Why were they using our product? Why did they choose us? What impact were they looking to have? I was trying to understand, how did they define success in terms of using our product? And it was never around the metrics that we often worry about in CS. It was never around usage or utilization or logins per day. No customer I've ever spoken to is worried about that. We worry about it, the customer doesn't. So I always try to get under the skin of what's the customer's metric? What is their definition of success? How do they define value? Once we started to understand that and plan for that and be able to accommodate that in how we supported customers, we were able to say very, very clearly that needle start to tick up on the net revenue retention, because with some exceptions, customers tend to leave because they're not seeing value. If they can see the value, they more than often tend to stay, which of course impacts NRR. I should add that sometimes it can take quite some time for the NRR to be seen, particularly if you're working with 12-month plus contracts. Those things can sometimes take some time to be evidenced. But that was the single biggest factor in that playbook, was understanding the customer's definition of success. You also mentioned the time to value. We already had a playbook of sorts when I started in that business. What I did was I split that playbook into two. We used to call it the onboarding playbook. And I split that down into implementation and adoption, both parts of which used to be covered in what they called the onboarding. Implementation and adoption. Once I split the two phases into two separate playbooks, we could better focus on the time to delivery of each one. So we had a smaller problem to solve rather than trying to solve a bigger problem. I was quite cutthroat in terms of how I approached that particular playbook, because I'm very conscious that you get one chance to have a first impression with a new customer. And that's usually the sales process, but I couldn't affect that. Once they become a customer, it's that whole onboarding experience. We were asking a lot of questions, a ton of questions of the customer just after they'd signed the contract. When I sat down and looked at those questions with the various team members, we realized that some of them should be being asked during the sales process. Some of them were quite rightly supposed to be asked just after the contract had been signed. But a massive percentage of questions didn't need to be asked at that point. They needed to be asked days or weeks or months down the line. We didn't need to know the answers to deliver that first value. Once we'd stripped them out and we asked the questions at the right place, we were able to significantly reduce the time to value for new customers coming on board. So from that perspective, I broke the problem down into smaller pieces, and I was merciless in terms of looking at every single question and step that we took and asked, do we need to ask it at this stage? And if we didn't, it went.
Okay. I think when it comes to questions, I think that's the hardest thing. What you ask, when you ask, how do you phrase it? Because I've been trying multiple times from my marketing role to find out the story behind the customer and how did we actually help them. And I realized that it was harder. In some cases, in order to get the answers that I had to answer the same thing, but in different ways, in different moments, to make sure that the users tell me or the customer tells me what exactly I need to find out, or the information that I have to work with later on. And what I noticed in some cases that the customer didn't even know, where they are telling you what you want to hear. And you need to overcome this barrier. Because at least in our case, whenever we are trying to find out, okay, how can we help you? Why did you end up buying this CSE? It's usually, okay, I want to reduce churn. That's a bigger thing. So everybody is coming up with generic, CS challenges. And it's like, okay, I understand that part, but let's, go deeper. And I'm curious, how did you end up with the perfect questions? What was your process?
Knowing what the person next in line from an implementation perspective needed to know, what was the bare minimum that person needed for the next stage to be completed? Not what would be nice to know or what might be useful to know, what was imperative that they knew for that next stage of implementation to occur. That was pretty much the filter that I used. If it wasn't imperative, if it wasn't mission critical, it got asked later. And it was as simple as that. And once I put that filter on the questions, that's where we realized a huge chunk, 70 to 80% of the questions we were asking, they still needed to be asked. They were important questions, but they weren't important then. They were important the following week, or maybe the week after that. They weren't important. When we stopped asking those questions, and this is where the biggest time delay was. If we were asking a customer 30 questions, for example, it's incredibly unlikely that that individual filling the form out knew the answer to all 30. So they had to go and find the answers. That took time. That delayed things. We were on the clock then. As a business, we had signed the customer. We were on the clock. We were actually making our own lives more difficult and making ourselves look poor from a time to best value perspective because we'd asked so many questions. When we find the questions and we're asking maybe 5, 6, 7 questions, either that person knew them all, in which case sometimes we'd get the form back the same day, or maybe there's a few people they needed to ask. Maybe we'd get the form back the following day. But just by being more refined, we put less burden on the customer's shoulders. We got the data back quicker. We could act on the data.
Awesome. I want to ask you, because you've been in several leadership positions, and I know that you need a set of assets where you need ammunition to work with whenever you are starting a new role. What do you need in order to be successful in a new CS leadership role? What do you ask from the hiring manager, from the CEO, from the board of directors? It doesn't matter. What do you need to be successful?
I think there are a number of things, but I would caveat them all by saying they're probably the same things that anybody starting in any new role, possibly leadership and management roles, but I would say that anybody needs the sort of things that I'd be looking for. I'm looking for support from my leaders. I'm looking for support from my peers, my team, and I'm looking for support from the wider business. What does support look like? Well, it looks like people trusting what I say. It looks like healthy challenge. I think challenging for the sake of being challenging is one thing, but healthy challenging is an incredibly valuable thing. I think it looks like people willing to take a risk, and you've just parachuted a new head of customer success in to set up an entirely new function. You're probably doing that because you don't have somebody in the business that's capable of doing it already. Therefore, whatever they ask you to do, probably going to feel a little bit alien, a little bit strange. Maybe it feels like there's potentially some friction with the way you've constantly done things in the past. So that understanding and that willingness to take a risk are the things that I would look for in anybody that was, from a leadership perspective. But again, I would say that those are things that anybody starting in a new role, particularly in a change management type role, will be looking for the same kind of support and resources from within their business.
I'm curious, speaking about the CS team that you are leading, what's your process for building a strong CS team from the ground up?
I think there are two approaches, I suppose. From the ground up would assume that there is nobody already in place within the business. There's not already a team of CSMs in place, and I've been brought in to develop that. I think there are pros and cons to taking that approach. One of the cons is there's nobody in place already. Nobody is doing the work that are probably going to need doing. So from a time scale perspective, creating and then building that forming, norming, performing and storming team evolution, that all needs to be done from day one. The positive of that is, yes, it might take some time, but in my experience, you can recruit for exactly the sort of person or people that you are looking for with the right attitude, the right skill set, the right experience. You're not having to try and mold somebody that's already in a role, perhaps isn't performing the way that you need that people to perform. So there's a time scale perspective, but the advantage is you can truly nurture and grow that team from scratch. Of course, the flip side of the coin is if you've got an established team, great. A lot of the work is already being done, but it might not be being done in the most optimal fashion. It might not be following the most best of practice ways of doing it. So whilst you can carry on performing, there's a huge amount of change management that might be needed. People might need to be retrained. People might, unfortunately, have to move on from roles if they're not open to being able to make those necessary changes. So I think there are pros and cons of building from scratch versus an established team. If I were to have my choice all the time, every time, which I rarely do, I'd always love to build a team from scratch, because I think that from a personal perspective, there's a huge amount of personal pride that I take in that. But equally, it does come with the challenges of the timescale involved.
Now, I want to ask you something which some of our listeners might find controversial, but I've recently seen some LinkedIn discussions on why VP of sales roles have a 12 months turnover. Now, I want to ask you, how long do you think a CS leader needs to make a meaningful impact on business metrics? What's the mandate, or what's the minimal time frame that you have a real chance to prove that you can impact the business KPIs?
So I'm going to be one of those annoying interviewees that comes up with the two-word answer. It depends.
Oh, okay. It depends. Okay.
But let me caveat the why it depends. You used the phrase business metrics there a few times during that question. And the it depends on what that business metric is. What is it that CS leader is expected to be able to change? Because some business metrics can be affected comparatively quickly compared to other business metrics. So, for example, if perhaps a CS leader is being asked to improve advocacy opportunities, increase the number of champions and case studies and advocacy opportunities we've got. That might be relatively quite quick to do, assuming that you've got good products with good support and the customers enjoy using you. You might already have a really healthy, fertile bed of advocates to pick from, in which case the hard work of being a good vendor is already done. You just need to select those advocates and engage with them to create opportunities. That might take weeks or months, but it might not take very long. But that might be a business metric, increase advocacy opportunities. Compare that to improve renewal rates or increase NRR. They're things that potentially might need some fairly fundamental changes to be made, either in the product or the way that you work with customers. And even if you've got a great product and great customers and you're already doing good stuff, depending on what your billing cycle is and what your renewal cycle is, like I mentioned earlier in the call, it might take you 12 months to start to see and bear the fruits of work that you started today with new great playbooks and processes. That might take 12 months before you can see the impact of that on that particular cohort of customers. So that's, through pure passage of time, is going to take longer, potentially, than the business metric of increased advocacy opportunities. And that's why the answer is, it depends. It depends on what that business metric is. Depends, I think, on how long it is fair and reasonable to give that CS leader the time to show the outputs of the work that they'd come in and had an effect on.
Let's bring technology in our discussion. And I want to know how you leverage it. I know that I saw it on your LinkedIn profile that you implemented a CSP in 3 months. And now I have to ask, how did you manage to get the budget approval for implementing the CSP? Because in some organization, there are board of directors or CEOs that consider that this is not necessarily needed. And of course, there are workarounds that can be implemented. What was your pitch?
This is going to sound surprisingly similar to the question you asked me earlier on about how did I get into customer success. It was really opportunistic. It was one of those moments when all the stars aligned perfectly. The book just fell open at the right page. During the summer of 2022, I was interviewing for a new role. During that interview process, which involved the CCO, Chief Commercial Officer, Chief Ops Officer, Chief Executive Officer, were all involved in that recruitment process. It became quite apparent by them telling me that one of the challenges they were facing was that their customer data was in lots of different best-of-breed platforms, ticketing systems, product enablement systems, people's inboxes, CRM, so on and so forth. It was all over the place. And that's somewhat understandable. You know, any established business that's quite mature is probably going to be using best-of-breed platforms to do individual activities. The problem it led then, they were about 20, 25 years they'd been around, so they had a lot of customer data, was that there was no single place to go and look at their customer data. And they recognized that. They were saying that decisions sometimes were being made without recognizing the full picture of a customer. So they brought this up as a challenge a few times during the various calls I had with them. And when I mentioned about CSPs, they hadn't heard of them. They didn't know they existed. They were aware of a CRM, but they weren't aware of a CSP, that product that takes over after the sale and marketing happens. So once I mentioned it to them, they seemed incredibly keen. They wanted to know more about it. I did think to myself, am I giving too much away during the interview here? Are they just going to go and do this themselves? What I was really pleased was that I got the job. I started in that role on the 1st of September. One of the first things the CEO said to me was, we want to get up and running with this CSP. He remembered it. I didn't have to take it to him. He remembered it.
Okay.
We started a contract on the 1st of October. So I had 4 weeks to sort of source a provider and do the various selection process. We signed on the 1st of October. We did a soft internal launch in the first week of December, and we went live in the first week of January with real customers. So I didn't have to go in there and sell the benefits of the CSP. They presented to me the challenges of not having a CSP And I just magically waved this magic wand and mentioned it to them, and the stars aligned and things fell into place from that point onwards. So it's very opportunistic.
And indeed, I think it was that rarely chance when the CEO comes and asks and facilitates. And I think indeed you are lucky because you pitch it at the right time and they also listened to this part. You mentioned that you went through screening different platforms. What was your process look like? What were you looking for? What was the most important? How did you took the decision? Yeah, I'm going to go with A or I'm going to go with B.
Well, I think anybody that's listening to this has ever procured any form of software, sort of enterprise level, business-wide level software. There's a lot to go through. There's a lot of hoops to jump through. So I won't sort of list out slavishly every single feature or functionality. No. But broadly speaking, I was looking for three things. I would look for these three things probably in any other type of software that I was looking at. The first thing I'm looking for is, can it solve the problem we've got today?
Okay.
Not it's on the roadmap or we're thinking about it or it's in beta testing. Can it solve the problem that we have come to you with today, right now, out of the box?
Yeah.
If it can, that's great. The next thing that I'm looking for is, can it solve tomorrow's problem that I don't know that I've got yet? Now, that's something of a cryptic question because we don't know what the future holds. But what I mean by that is, if the product can solve today's problem for me, but there are no extra features or functionality, I'm literally using every drop of power of the product. What do I do tomorrow? What do I do in 3 months or 6 months' time when we're looking to expand our CS thinking? We've run out of engine power. We've run out of features and functionality. So I'm always looking for a product that does more than what I need it to today, that I can grow into. I can mature into that product further down the line. And the third thing that I'm looking for has got nothing to do with the product at all. It's to do with the company itself, the provider of that product. So I'm wanting to work with a software partner that gets customer success. And I think that's a very different thing than a company that gets their product.
Okay.
They should understand their product. They should be able to understand their product inside out, back to front. But I want them to understand the world in which their product lives, the customer success world. So when I was going through that selection process, I was listening for how the sales development people spoke about customer success. I was looking for how those pre-sales engineers spoke to me. Were they just talking about their features and functionality, or were they putting it in the bigger picture? We were also fortunate they brought in the CSM that would probably be working with us if we were to buy the product. And that particular guy he was also called Ben, actually. Different guy. I just blew my mind in terms of just how much extra value he could bring above and beyond telling me what buttons to press or what levers to pull. So those are the things that I look for. Can it solve today's problems? Do I have space to grow into the product? Does this company understand the world of customer success beyond just their product features? And I found a provider that did all of those. And as I say, we signed within 4 weeks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this, for coming up with your three most important elements to when you are picking up a new software. Because I also want to be mindful with the time, and I don't want to end this conversation without actually asking you about SimplePoll and the company with whom you are now. What are your short-term objectives in terms of CS? What are you focusing on as we speak? What are the problems that you are trying to solve as we speak?
So to wrap all of that up into one, SimplePoll is an app that lives in the Slack store, in the App Store for Slack. So it's a polling app that plugs into Slack. So to use our product, you already need to be using Slack.
Yeah.
I give that context because there are a lot of Slack users out there, a lot. And a lot of them have our app installed. And I'm the only person in our CS team. I'm the head of customer success, but I'm the only person within that CS team there. So that might unsurprisingly lead you to realize that the thing that I'm focused on the most is adopting 99.99% of the time, I have to adopt a digital customer success approach. And I know that's a term that's been bandied around a lot over the past couple of years, digital customer success. But this role truly is a digital customer success role. Very few of my customers I ever talk to like we are now. Okay. Most of them I need to work out from a data perspective and a usage perspective and a range of other factors. When do I need to communicate them? About what? Giving what information? What's the best channel at what time to communicate to them? So a huge amount of my time, 99% of my time is spent focusing on digital first customer success. And although you use the word challenge, and it is a challenge, it's actually an amazing personal development opportunity because I've never worked anywhere that has such a digital first focus. So it is a challenge, but in that challenge presents some wonderful development opportunities for me in terms of getting to grips with an element of customer success that I've never dealt with at this scale before.
This probably requires a dedicated episode or maybe also a webinar theme. But I want to ask you, what did you start when you implemented the digital CS strategy? Or what does a digital strategy approach mean for you in the case of SimplePoll?
In the case of SimplePoll, firstly, I didn't implement it. They already had a CSP before I started, and the CEO was the previous head of customer success. So I've taken over, very capable hand I took over from. Digital customer success, we are looking to be able to tap the right person at the right time on the shoulder with the right information that they need in the right channel. We can't just rely upon a monthly or a quarterly success review or QBR to bring things up because they simply don't exist. So we are constantly looking for ways to be able to give the right information to the right person at the right time in the right channel. Very simplistic way, and that just trips off the tongue nicely. There's a lot involved in that, but that is, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do at SimplePoll from a digital first customer success perspective.
Greg, my last question before we wrap up. I want to know who has been the biggest influence on your career and what's the best piece of advice they gave you that still sticks with you today?
I've had lots of jobs over the years, from the military to learning and development to customer success. I've had lots of bosses, so it's impossible to try and think of one person that's given a piece of advice. But there is a person that I worked with who wasn't a boss of mine. He was a peer of mine when I worked at HT2 Labs, that first exposure to customer success that I mentioned. He's a Scottish guy called Dave Tosh, based out in Canada at the moment. And he said to me words to the effect of, and I'm going to do a terrible job of paraphrasing what he said, but it was something along the lines of this. Within a particular software space, there are various competitors, and they're all pretty much doing the same thing. Some people will have a feature that somebody else does, and then they'll catch up and release another feature. It's all pretty level pegging. Just like in the CSP world, they're all pretty similar. Mm-hmm. The thing that sets them apart isn't their code base, it's their human base. It's the people that talk to those customers, that help them, that support them, that guide them, that help them set some strategic direction for how they're going to use that code base. Now, he didn't put it as waffly as I did there. He had a wonderful way of summing up, but I think that's the best piece of advice I've ever been given from a SaaS/customer success perspective. The products are all pretty much on an even keel. It's the humans that sit alongside those products where the real differentiator can happen.
Thank you so much, Greg, for sharing your insights with us today. And a big thank you to all our listeners. Until next time, stay safe and keep mastering customer success.